Have you ever considered that stupidity might not simply be the lack of intelligence, but rather something far darker and more dangerous? Imagine it as an invisible force that can twist sharp, brilliant minds into tools of destruction. What if the biggest danger to our world isn't cruel people plotting evil, but instead everyday individuals who, little by little, stop questioning and stop thinking? Think about it. A respected scientist with decades of knowledge suddenly begins spreading conspiracy theories. A kind teacher, once devoted to helping students grow, starts endorsing destructive ideas. A loving parent makes choices that unknowingly put their own children at risk. These people aren't villains. They're not lacking education. They're ordinary, intelligent, often well-intentioned individuals who fall prey to what Dietrich Bonhoeffer once described as the power of stupidity. And here's the terrifying part. It's not just happening somewhere else, it's happening around us to people like you and me. History proves this. In 1961, Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments revealed how ordinary people, when told by an authority, were willing to deliver electric shocks they thought could kill. They weren't evil, just normal individuals who surrendered their independent judgment. Bonhoeffer witnessed the same thing in Nazi Germany. To him, the scariest enemy wasn't evil, but the mass surrender of critical thought. From that, he developed one of the most haunting theories about human nature. Bonhoeffer's background and the rise of Nazi Germany. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was not some detached philosopher sitting comfortably in a library, theorizing about human behavior from a distance. He was a pastor, a theologian, and most importantly, a witness to one of history's darkest chapters. Born in 1906 into a family of academics and thinkers. His father was a highly respected psychiatrist and neurologist. Bonhoeffer grew up with every reason to trust in the power of reason, discussion, and education. For much of his early life, he believed that knowledge and rational dialogue could protect people from harmful ideologies. After all, Germany was home to some of the world's greatest universities, scientists, and cultural institutions. If any society could resist mass manipulation, surely it would be his. But as the 1930s unfolded, Bonhoeffer's faith in rationality began to shatter. He watched in disbelief as neighbors, friends, teachers, clergy members, and intellectuals, people who were educated, cultured, and deeply religious, began supporting a regime whose values stood in stark opposition to everything they claimed to hold dear. These weren't uneducated peasants blindly following propaganda. They were professors, doctors, ministers, and respected professionals. Yet many of them willingly set aside their ability to question and instead aligned themselves with the Nazi movement. To Bonhoeffer, it was as if he were watching his society voluntarily hand over its collective mind. The frightening part wasn't just the lies being told by those in power. It was how quickly ordinary people embraced those lies, silencing their own doubts in the process. From his prison cell in 1943, after being arrested for resisting the Nazi regime and his involvement in a plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, Bonhoeffer began writing what would later be considered his most haunting reflections. It was here, awaiting execution, that he arrived at a disturbing conclusion. Against stupidity, he wrote, we are defenseless. This idea wasn't just another observation about human weakness. It was a diagnosis of something far more corrosive. Bonhoeffer noticed that when someone gives in to stupidity, logical arguments no longer reach them. Evidence, reason, and debate bounce off as if they no longer matter. He compared it with evil itself. Evil, he explained, often carries the seeds of its own destruction. People know deep down when they are doing wrong, and that awareness creates resistance, discomfort, and eventually collapse. Stupidity, however, disguises itself as righteousness. Those caught in it believe they are on the side of good, which makes them virtually immune to correction. This is what Bonhoeffer found so chilling. In his eyes, stupidity was not just an individual failure, but a social sickness that spread quickly in groups, making entire communities incapable of independent thought. And as he saw firsthand, it wasn't only the uneducated who were vulnerable, it was society's brightest minds who were surrendering most easily. Obedience and conformity experiments. Bonhoeffer's disturbing insight didn't remain confined to the 1940s. In the decades that followed, psychologists began running experiments that revealed just how easily ordinary people could be pushed into abandoning their own judgment. One of the most famous was Stanley Milgram's obedience study, conducted in 1961 at Yale University. Volunteers and everyday men and women were invited under the impression that they were participating in research about memory and learning. Each was instructed by an authority figure to deliver what they believed were increasingly powerful electric shocks to another person whenever a wrong answer was given. The shocks weren't real, but the participants didn't know that. They could hear the supposed victim screaming in pain, begging for the punishment to stop. Yet astonishingly, 65% of participants continued pressing the switches all the way up to what they believed were potentially lethal levels, simply because an authority in a lab coat calmly told them to go on. These weren't cruel individuals. They weren't mentally unstable or inherently violent. They were ordinary people, people like you and me, who momentarily surrendered their moral compass to someone else's instructions. A few years later, another experiment pushed this idea even further. Psychologist Solomon Asch wanted to explore the power of group influence. In his conformity experiments, participants were shown simple visual tests, like comparing the lengths of lines on paper. The correct answer was obvious, yet when placed in a group where others deliberately gave wrong answers, 3 out of 4 participants conformed at least once, going along with the crowd even though they knew the answer was wrong. Taken together, these experiments echoed exactly what Bonhoeffer had witnessed in Nazi Germany. The terrifying realization was that stupidity, as he described it, was not merely about low intelligence or lack of education. It was about how easily people could silence their own judgment under pressure, whether that pressure came from an authority figure, a group, or a larger social system. And what's even more alarming is how these dynamics have only become stronger in today's interconnected world. What was once limited to the walls of a laboratory or the reach of a political regime now spreads instantly through algorithms, media, and online communities. Functional stupidity and systemic pressures. When Bonhoeffer used the word stupidity, he didn't mean someone with a low IQ or a lack of formal education. His concern was far more complex. What he described was a condition that modern thinkers might call functional stupidity, a kind of willful ignorance that allows otherwise intelligent people to stop questioning and simply repeat the slogans and ideas handed to them. In his prison writings, he explained that talking with such a person often feels like you're not speaking to an individual at all, but to a collection of phrases and catchwords that have taken over their thinking. The frightening part is that this isn't just a personal weakness. It emerges from broader social forces that reward conformity and punish independent thought. Think about the systems we live in today. Our economic and political structures actively incentivize shortcuts in thinking. Social media platforms thrive when we react emotionally, not when we carefully consider information. News outlets are rewarded with clicks and views when they offer outrage and simplicity instead of nuance and depth. Politicians win elections more easily with catchy slogans than with detailed policy discussions. And on top of all this, life for many people is exhausting. Juggling multiple jobs, paying bills, dealing with debt, and facing constant streams of information, it leaves little time or energy for careful analysis. Under those pressures, intellectual surrender starts to look like a survival strategy. Economists even have a term for it: rational ignorance. It's the idea that, in many cases, people find it more efficient to remain uninformed about complicated issues than to invest the effort to fully understand them. But here's the paradox. While it may feel rational for the individual, collectively it creates widespread irrationality. And that's precisely the danger Bonhoeffer saw in Germany. A whole society drifting toward unthinking conformity, not because people were too stupid to know better, but because the systems around them made deep thinking costly, uncomfortable, and sometimes even dangerous. Our own brains play a role too. Under stress and constant pressure, we're wired to fall back on habits, authority, and group consensus. Bonhoeffer was far ahead of his time in noticing that stupidity flourishes not in isolation, but in groups where individuals find it easier to suppress their doubts to belong. This insight would later be confirmed by psychological research, but Bonhoeffer saw it decades earlier. He realized that stupidity is less of a personal flaw and more of a social phenomenon, one that grows stronger when people stop thinking for themselves and begin echoing the voices around them. Modern parallels: social media, algorithms, and misinformation. Bonhoeffer may have been writing in the 1940s, but the patterns he described are even more visible today. If stupidity thrives in groups and under social pressure, then our modern digital world has created the perfect breeding ground. Think about how social media works. Algorithms are not designed to encourage careful reasoning or nuanced debate. They're built to capture attention, and the fastest way to do that is through emotional triggers. Outrage spreads faster than facts. Anger and fear travel more quickly than thoughtful analysis. A study from MIT in 2018 showed that false information on Twitter spreads 6 times faster than the truth. Why? Because lies are often crafted to feel simpler, more emotional, and more satisfying than the complicated reality. When someone shares misinformation that fits their worldview, they feel validated. The algorithm then rewards them with more of the same content, tightening the bubble around them. Slowly, these echo chambers form, environments where the same narratives are repeated so often that they begin to feel like an undeniable truth. Bonhoeffer had warned about people repeating catchphrases instead of thinking for themselves. Today, that process is turbocharged by recommendation systems designed to maximize engagement. And the effects aren't just theoretical. Look at history. During the Salem witch trials, devout citizens sincerely believed they were protecting their communities. In the 1950s Red Scare, patriotic Americans were convinced they were defending democracy, even as they destroyed lives based on paranoia. These weren't cartoon villains. They were normal people swept up in collective fear and certainty. The digital age has taken those same dynamics and placed them on a global stage. Instead of local rumors spreading in a town square, we now have billions of people receiving instant streams of curated information, much of it designed to provoke, not to inform. Add in AI-generated content and deepfakes, and the challenge becomes even more severe. We're not just fighting human propaganda anymore. We're confronting automated systems engineered to exploit our deepest cognitive shortcuts. This is exactly the scenario Bonhoeffer warned about, only magnified. He saw newspapers and radios being used to spread Nazi propaganda. We live in an era where misinformation can be tailored to each individual, targeting their fears, their preferences, and even their insecurities with surgical precision. It's not just the spread of stupidity that's terrifying. It's the way our tools have been built to encourage it. Bonhoeffer's teachings and possible solutions. If Bonhoeffer was right, that stupidity isn't simply ignorance but a deeper surrender of thought, then the question becomes, how do we resist it? How do we avoid falling into the same trap ourselves? For Bonhoeffer, the answer was never easy or comfortable. He spoke of what he called costly grace. It meant choosing to think independently even when doing so came with a price. When it made you unpopular, when it left you isolated, or even when it put you in danger. To him, genuine freedom of thought was never free. It demanded courage. Today, psychology offers insights that echo his warnings. Researchers speak about intellectual humility, the ability to admit that our knowledge is limited, that we might be wrong, and that we need to test our beliefs against evidence. This isn't a weakness. It's a safeguard against the trap of stubborn certainty. There are practical ways to build this habit. Seek out friction. Deliberately read or listen to arguments from people you disagree with. Not necessarily to change your mind, but to stress test your convictions. Ask yourself what would change your mind. If you can't imagine any evidence strong enough to challenge a belief, that's a warning sign you might be caught in dogma. Pause before sharing. In a digital environment where every click can spread misinformation, even a short delay to verify a source can break the cycle. Learn to say, "I don't know." In a culture that rewards confident ignorance, admitting uncertainty is an act of strength, not weakness. But Bonhoeffer also understood that personal discipline alone isn't enough. Structural changes are necessary. If our environment makes honest thinking exhausting, then we need to design systems that make careful thought easier, not harder. That could mean requiring tech companies to be transparent about the biases in their algorithms. It could mean large-scale media literacy programs that equip people to analyze information critically. It could mean political and economic reforms that reduce the daily stressors, housing, healthcare, financial insecurity, that push people into survival mode, where shortcuts replace careful judgment. Bonhoeffer's call was clear. Resisting stupidity requires both personal courage and societal responsibility. It's not a battle fought once, but a daily struggle to remain alert, thoughtful, and unwilling to hand over our minds to the loudest voices around us. Bonhoeffer's life ended tragically. In April 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, he was executed for refusing to surrender his conscience. According to those who witnessed his final moments, his last words were, "This is the end, but for me, the beginning of life." His death wasn't just political resistance. It was the ultimate defense of independent thought. For him, to give up thinking critically was to give up part of what makes us truly human. Without independent judgment, people become, as he described, like puppets. Their strings pulled by whichever force happens to be strongest at the time. That is why his warning remains so urgent today. Who will stand firm when the cost of truth becomes unbearable? The challenge is not about being more intelligent or better educated. It's about making small but courageous choices, choosing curiosity over certainty, patience over quick reactions, truth over comforting lies. These aren't grand heroic acts. They are daily habits that only feel heroic in a world where so many have given them up. The tragedy of intellectual surrender is that it often feels liberating. To stop questioning can feel like relief. To silence doubt can feel like peace. But that comfort comes at the cost of our freedom. Bonhoeffer argued that this discomfort of thinking, of wrestling with complexity, of admitting uncertainty, is the very price of remaining human. And this is where his message becomes personal. None of us are immune. The moment we believe we're safe from functional stupidity is the very moment we begin to fall into it. True vigilance isn't about guarding against others. It's about guarding against our own tendency to stop thinking when thinking gets hard. But here's the hopeful part. If stupidity is learned, it can also be unlearned. If it spreads through systems, those systems can be changed. If it grows in the absence of questioning, it can be resisted by nurturing the habit of honest curiosity. So here's a challenge for you. Sometime this week, take one belief you hold very strongly and spend at least half an hour exploring the best arguments against it. Not to torture yourself with doubt, but to strengthen your intellectual courage. If your belief stands up under scrutiny, you'll hold it more firmly. If it doesn't, you'll have gained something even more valuable: the truth. Because in a world designed to profit from our surrender, the simple act of thinking carefully may be the most radical resistance left to us. Every time you choose evidence over emotion, reflection over reaction, or humility over arrogance, you're defending something bigger than yourself, the very possibility of wisdom in an age of artificial ignorance.